Tonight we're going to begin a study on Philippians, and each week we'll have a different teacher. So my assignment for tonight is to do the introduction to Philippians, and I'm also going to give you some background about the book and the place. So Philippians, got two buttons to push. Philippians is one of the books that Paul wrote while he was in prison, and we believe he was in Rome at the time when he wrote this because there's several references to the imperial guards. Clement is mentioned, and he was one of the early church fathers or the early church leaders in Rome, and there's several other references that lead people to believe that he was in Rome when he wrote this. So there are some other theories, but for the most part, most everyone agrees with that. These just happen to be the cities where Paul wrote the various books, as best we understand it, from about 50 to 65 AD, while he was on his various missionary journeys. While Paul was in Rome at this time, he was under house arrest. He wasn't in a dungeon or in an official prison. He was paying for this apartment, and he could have visitors, people come and go, and he could talk to them. But he did have guards, and he talks about witnessing to these guards. These were fairly high-ranking guards, and so he had an opportunity to witness to them. So this is during 60 to 62 AD. And it's interesting, one of the people I was reading from said that Philippians struck him as being the kind of note that a soldier would write right before he was going to go into battle the next day. And the chance of death was very possible. But this was his note home to try to be reassuring to the people that meant something to him. So he's writing this note back to the Philippians, who he loves, and trying to give them some peace of mind that he doesn't know if he's going to die or not, or be executed or not, but he's trying to help reassure them. That's one of the themes. He says, "Don't worry about me, since joy is independent of our circumstances, because our salvation is in Christ." So that's one of the underlying themes that we'll be touching on in the weeks to come. Another major theme in Philippians is humility. He keeps citing Jesus, saying that here was Jesus, he was God, and he came to earth, but he humbled himself, took on flesh, a fleshly body, and dwelled among us, and lived like we did. So who are we to think that we ought to be, thought of highly when the Lord came here and lived a very common life, a very unadorned life? So be like Jesus, be humble, empty ourselves like he did. Another major theme that we'll find as we go through Philippians is unity. The Philippians had, as you'll find out in the weeks to come, had false teachers that were coming in, and people who were trying to elevate themselves above the other Christians and kind of draw people away from the one true message. So Paul does take a lot of time in his writings to try to point this out to them. Don't be led astray. Stay united, stay focused. Don't let people draw you away from the true message of Christ. So while he was in prison, we read in 2 Timothy 4, 16 through 17, he talks about the first time he was in prison. And it's believed that during Paul's first arrest, this time when he was under house arrest, he was actually brought before Nero. And we see in Acts 27-24 the story of the storm that Paul was on a boat, and there was a terrible storm for days and days, and an angel came to him and said, "Don't worry, you're not going to die because you've got to stand before Caesar. And so he told the people that were on the boat with him, this angel told me that none of us are going to die. And then they shipwrecked in Malta. And sure enough, the indication here in 2 Timothy 4:16 through 17 says, "At my first trial, no one supported me as an advocate or stood with me, but they all deserted me. May it not be counted against them by God. But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me and empowered me, so that through me the gospel message might be fully proclaimed, that all the Gentiles might hear it, and I was rescued from the mouth of the lion." So this reference to the mouth of the lion is kind of an indication that he did actually go before Nero. Nero was the Caesar at the time, and he was acquitted, evidently, because he was released and went on to, it's believed, have another missionary journey where one of the stops might have been Spain, even at that time. So from this time period, the indication is he's still, in 2 Timothy, he's still under arrest, but he's talking about the first time he was under arrest. And that's the time they believe he went before Nero and was acquitted. Remember, Paul asked to go to Rome to defend himself against the Jews who had said that he was allowing Gentiles to come into the temple and defile it. And so he asked to defend himself as a Roman citizen. He had that right. So, and you'll see these pictures of Paul, just as an aside. Sometimes it looks like he's in his mid-60s. Sometimes it looks like he's in his mid-50s. People don't really know exactly when he was born. Some think it was 5 AD. Some think it's 5 BC. So he could be, at this time period, he could be anywhere from 55 to 65 years old. And Nero would have been about 30 years old at that time. So let's look at some background about the city and the people of Philippi. How did Philippi get its name? Well, you may have heard of Philip II of Macedon. He was the king of Macedonia, and he conquered a Greek town called Crownridge, I believe is how it's pronounced, in 356 BC, and he changed the name to name the city after himself, so he called it Philippi. The interesting thing about Philippi is there were gold mines there, and it was a very strategic capture of the city. He used the gold, which turned out to be about $1 billion a year, to pay off Greek politicians and to fund his army. And so he was a very, sorry, I got to pay attention. Philip II. So you may wonder what happened to his eye there. About 2 years after he captured Philippi, he was taking another town, and an archer hit him in the eye with an arrow, and they had to take his eye out. But it gives him that pretty ruthless look. So when he captured this city and changed the name to Philippi, he built a perimeter wall around it. It's about 2 miles long around it. At the time, there were only about 10,000 people that lived there. So this wall stayed intact for many, many years, even during the Roman period. Up on top of the hill is where the idols would be, the Greek statues for the various gods. You can see down in the lower right-hand corner, there's a amphitheater. When he built that amphitheater, it would hold about 3,500 people. And the Romans, we'll talk about that in just a second. But you can see it's pretty protected. So Philip, like I said, was the king of Macedonia, which is northern Greece. And he began to, like he said, took the gold, built up his army, and he began to go south and either buy off or conquer all the Greek states that were south of him. So he united everything that is now Greece under him. It took the rest of his career to do that. And so you might not know him, but you probably know his son, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great leveraged the power and the money that his father had built up, and he took that and ran with it. I mean, he was a very, very smart guy and very strategic planner. So over the next 11 years, he finished the unification of Greece into what was called Macedonia at the time. You can see Philippi is represented by the red star there. So Philippi is right in the heart of where all this activity is taking place, and where Alexander starts his campaign. He goes into Turkey, takes all of Turkey. He goes into the Middle East, across the Armenia, into Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, and parts of India, all the way that far east. And of course he takes Egypt as well. But Philippi is at the heart of this expanding empire of Alexander the Great. Alexander died in 323 BC unexpectedly, but his legacy lived on. Because of his conquest of all these different countries, he established a common language, Koine Greek. Koine Greek is what the apostles used to write the New Testament with, and it was a kind of the common language of the Mediterranean at the time. And the Koine Greek was also the language of science, philosophy, politics. With the Greeks, or with Alexander the Great coming in, he brought their art, literature, theater, customs, and also the Greek religion, which Paul would have to deal with later on Mars Hill. Like I said, Alexander the Great died, and there was a big turmoil amongst his generals and the people who were left in power. Philippi ended up under Cassander. Cassander was the son of the regent that Alexander had left in charge of Macedonia. Though in order to consolidate his power, Cassander married his Alexander the Great's half-sister, Thessalonica. He killed Alexander the Great's only child, or official child, Alexander the Fourth, and then he suppressed Alexander the Great's mother, Olympia. And so by doing that, he claimed Macedonia and everything south, whatever was left that was Greek, and became the king of that area. So that was Philippi's history right after Alexander the Great. About 133 years later, Philippi gets handed over to another superpower, Rome. The Roman Empire began to do what Alexander the Great was doing, and that was sweep across the Mediterranean and conquer all the lands around the Mediterranean, North Africa. And in so doing, they got Philippi about 168 BC. At that time, it became a protectorate of Rome. And so I don't think there was an actual battle fought for it, but it was now a part of Rome officially. Philippi was a very famous city in ancient times. one of the main reasons it was so famous because there was a major battle that was fought there on the plains just outside of Philippi. The Roman legions that were represented by Octavian, who was an adopted son of Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony fought against the Roman legions of Cassius and Brutus, one of the two assassins of Julius Caesar. So there was a big civil war in the Roman, in the Roman, wasn't the empire at the time, it's the Roman Republic. And on the field, there were 200,000 soldiers. That's half of the active duty military in the United States right now, about half. So you can imagine how massive this battle was. Multiple battles. It took days to go through it, but Octavian and Mark Antony defeated, with their 19 Roman legions, they defeated the 17 Roman legions of Cassius and Brutus. Both those generals took their own lives because they could see the end coming. So because that was such a massive campaign, a lot of these soldiers were no longer needed. It was like they were now had things under control. Well, so they thought. And so some of these guys retired to Philippi, and Octavian actually put a group of soldiers there. So Philippi became a very well-respected Roman colony at that time because there were so many Romans living there. And so it had a lot of status, had a lot of high-ranking people from the Roman Empire or from the Roman Republic. And this took place in 42 BC. So at that time, this was, everybody knew about this battle throughout the world, that part of the world. What's interesting is that, and just a footnote, just a few years later, Octavian and Mark Antony fought Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And Octavian defeated Mark Antony and crowned himself Caesar. Well, Caesar was actually the last name of Julius Caesar. It was just the family name. But it now became a synonym for emperor because Octavian changed his name to Augustus Caesar. He was the adopted son, but now he's Caesar, and Caesar became synonymous with emperor. So just a little side. But anyway, Philippi was very famous for this battle and for all the people that were living there that had come from that time period. The thing that really put Philippi on the map was a little-known itinerant preacher at the time, anyway, named Paul. And it was on Paul's second missionary journey that we'll pick up the story of how he gets involved with Philippi. I left my Bible over there, but anyway, if we read in Acts 16:6 through 8, oops, sorry. Paul, second. Sorry, I don't have this thing synchronized. So Paul, on his second missionary journey, which is 49 to 52 AD, he starts off, and his intention is to go to Western Asia Minor, what is now Western Turkey, and to preach to several different cities, Pergamum and several other cities that he hadn't talked to yet. But the Holy Spirit comes to him and says, "You don't go there. Don't go there. I have other plans." So they end up getting diverted to Troas. And in Troas, Paul has a vision. Remember the Macedonian call. In Acts 16:9 through 10, it says, "During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, 'Come over to Macedonia and help us.' After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them." So this is the first time that Paul has been in the Macedonian area. And Macedonia, just to be clear, it's a Roman colony. It's in northern Greece, which I don't have it defined on this map, but that's kind of where it is. And he has now crossed into Europe. This is his first time into Europe. So, a very special first on many different levels. So, they land in Neapolis, and then they have to get over to Philippi. Philippi was a preeminent city still at that time for many reasons, but they decide to go to Philippi to do their preaching. So they land, like I said, they land in Neapolis. This is in AD 50, and it's assumed they walk about 11 miles to get to Philippi. And these are recreations of what, based on archaeological ruins, what Philippi might have looked like when Paul got there. You know, some of it's a little bit of extrapolation, but there are, if we have time, I'll show you the ruins that are there. So after Paul arrives, he's there for a few days, and he decides, I'm going to go outside the city walls to the river, because there's not a synagogue there, evidently, where he can go and teach. According to the Talmud and other references, you had to have at least 10 families to form a synagogue, so there's not even that many Jews, evidently, in Philippi at the time. But so he goes out to the river, the Gengeti, and the reason why he goes there is that's where Jews will gather sometimes if there is no synagogue, because the running waters make it a kind of a sanctified place. It's a purer place because of moving waters. It says in Acts 16:13, on the Sabbath we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. This river is later called Zygatis. You'll see it, or Zygatis. So in Acts 16:13, it says, we sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there at the river. One of the ladies was Lydia, a saleswoman from Thyatira in Turkey, a merchant of purple cloth. She was already a worshiper of God, and as she listened to us, the Lord opened her heart, and she accepted all that Paul was saying. So, and then later it says her household accepted Jesus, and she invited Paul and his missionary team to come and stay with her as her guest, and they accepted. So, very pivotal moment, and it's interesting. Here he is in Europe, but the first convert in Europe is actually a lady from Turkey. So, a little interesting twist there. Evidently, she was sent over as kind of a representative for the people who are dyeing purple cloth in Turkey, and so she's selling it in Europe or in Macedonia. So she's fairly wealthy, evidently. Now, right after that time, sorry, I did it again. So sorry. In class, this never happens because these things are synced. So anyway, there's Lydia by the side of the river, and evidently Paul was taking a few days. It took several days after that, after he converted, after he baptized Lydia, and was spending time preaching in Philippi proper. We don't have a lot of feedback on exactly what was going on at that time, but we do know that during this time sometime, there was a girl who was possessed of a demon who started following Paul and his party around. It says in Acts 16 through 17, it happened that as we were on our way to a place to pray, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination, that is, a demonic spirit claiming to foretell the future and discover hidden knowledge. She followed after Paul and us and kept screaming and shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God, They are proclaiming to you the way of salvation." She continued doing this for several days. What's interesting is she's telling the truth, but it's a demon inside her that's saying this. And so it's almost like Satan's trying to equivocate himself with Paul, make him on the same level as Paul by praising Paul, saying he's great, but also having it come from this girl who has the demon inside her. So it's a very confusing message, I'm sure, to the people that are hearing this. Is like, but Paul knows that this is not a good thing. You know, that having a demon is not, it's not going to end well for anybody. So he takes the initiative, cast out the demon, and of course he makes the owners, the girls' slave, the slave masters, very mad because she was making them a lot of money. Well, they draw attention to this fact, have Paul and Silas captured, and at the time, you'll notice when they're talking about receiving the message to go to Macedonia, the verb tense changed to we. So Luke was with them at that time, and it says that later. It says he was with them, and supposedly Timothy probably was with them also. So it had been 4 of them at least that we know of that were there. So Paul and Silas were the ones that got singled out. And it says in Acts 16:22, the crowd also joined in the attack against them, and the chief magistrates tore their robes off them and ordered that Paul and Silas be beaten with rods. So it's interesting that Paul has a warm spot in his heart for the Philippians, because he didn't have, at that time, he didn't have a very good experience on that day especially. So they took Paul and Silas probably to the Forum, based on the archaeological evidence there. It's the likely place where any kind of either executions or punishment would have been dealt out. And it's about 230 feet by 485 feet in size. Of course, Paul is a Roman citizen, so this is an unlawful beating. But this is what we find in Acts 16:22 and 23. Later that night, after the beating, it says the jailer threw Paul and Silas in the inner prison, the dungeon, and fastened their feet in the stocks in an agonizing position. Some people think that it would have spread their feet way apart and put them in a bind. But about midnight, when Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praises to God, the prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was a great earthquake. And we remember the story about the horrendous earthquake, and the chains fell from them, and they were free. When the jailer saw what had happened, he was about ready to commit suicide, because he'd been told, put these guys in the inner prison, don't let them get away, because we want to keep them as prisoners. There is actually a prison that they've identified just across the street from the Forum, so it's likely that might have been the place where they were put. But because Paul and Silas told the jailer, "Wait, stop! Don't do that. Don't take your own life. We're still here." And then they shared the gospel with the jailer. And we read in Acts 16:32 through 34. Then immediately he, the jailer, and all his household were baptized, and he was filled with the joy because he'd come to believe in God, he and his whole household. So another set of people who were some of the first Christians in Philippi. And who would have thought? You think about who would you be going after? Well, maybe some existing religious leader or whatever, but now here you have a Roman jailer. So it's interesting to note that Paul now plays his ace card, and when they come the next day to say, okay, now you can release these guys, now that they've seen the whole jail is cleared out, and it's like, we don't want these guys around if this is going to be the result, have mass disruption of the system. The magistrates come and say, okay, release these guys. But Paul says, no, I want the magistrates to come here in person because I want to, it's a way for them to show their sorry for what they did, to make them a form of apology. So they come, and we see that they're very worried because they know for beating a Roman citizen, they could either lose their position or themselves be punished in the same way. So it's a very severe mistake that they've made. So they tell Paul and Silas. We read in Acts 16, 39 through 40, as the magistrates of Philippi kept begging Paul and Silas to leave the city. So Paul and Silas left the prison, and they went to Lydia's house. When they had seen their brothers and sisters, they encouraged them and left for Thessalonica. So here we are to get an indication that Lydia's house was big enough to be able to facilitate at least the number of people that had been converted to that point. We don't know how many people that was. I mean, we have examples of who had been converted. If you look at the language about when they went to Thessalonica, it says they went to Thessalonica. So the implication is Luke stayed on. Philippi was already a city that was known for medical expertise. Luke was a physician. I don't know if that had anything to do with him staying behind, but he stayed behind evidently to help establish the church, get it started, get it running smoothly, and then later we see he catches up with the group. So that's not the last time that Paul came in contact with the church at Philippi. On his third missionary journey, 8 years later, he comes back through. Now, there's not a lot said about his stay there. It does say that he had communion with the group, but it was a busy time and plans were changing, and so the indication is they didn't have long to stay there and get to visit. But there are some other indications that there were other times later that he did have contact with the Christians in Philippi. But I'm not going to get into that because a lot of that's kind of doing some heavy-duty extrapolation. But there are people who believe that. So we saw from Acts 2, 4:16, when Paul was talking about the first time he was in prison, and then the indication was he escaped, or he escaped the mouth of the lion. So you take it that he was acquitted. But we do know that he was rearrested, and as the best they can tell, he was probably swept up with a lot of the Christians during the fire of Rome after AD 64, when Nero blamed the Christians for this big fire that swept through Rome. A lot of the Christians were gathered up. He may have been in that wave of people that were he may have been brought in independently of that, but it could have been with that group. The historical record outside the Bible says he was likely executed by beheading around 67 or 68 AD. We don't exactly know when that was, but here we go back to Paul. Remember the message he was sending the Philippians. Don't worry about me. I'm totally secure. In fact, you'll see in the weeks to come, he's already talking about, I'd almost be as happy to die and go to heaven as I would to stay here. And you'll hear his thoughts back and forth. But in 2 Timothy 4:6-8 it says, "The time of my departure from this world is at hand. Now I will soon go free. I have fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith, firmly guarding the gospel against error. In the future, there is reserved for me the victor's crown of righteousness." So he was very comfortable, or at least secure in his faith, knowing that if he died, he was going to be going to heaven and be able to receive his reward. I think I have a few minutes. If you don't mind, I'll show you the remnants. If you go to Philippi today, this is what you'll see. It's actually a UNESCO site, a UNESCO heritage site. And so there is a lot of good archaeological information there that they've been able to use to help understand what it was like to actually be a Roman citizen during that time period. You can see how tall the pillars are by the people that are standing at the bottom on that picture on the left. And so there are a lot of large buildings that were there. There was an earthquake that hit in the 600s and demolished a lot of this, and they just didn't rebuild it. But you can see some of the pillars. And this is the stadium that Philip II started, the amphitheater. And like I said, it held about 3,500 people when he built it. And then when the Romans expanded it, they made it seat about 5,000 people. So if you think about that in today's terms, Jones Hall downtown seats about 2,900 people. Hobby Center seats about 3,150. It says Cynthia Woods Mitchell, the covered part of it seats 6,500. Okay, maybe so, but that's a comparable something there. But during the Roman time period when Paul was there in Philippi, there were actually large walls that went around it on the back. It was almost not enclosed, but it had a perimeter to it. And the last thing I wanted to show you, on the river, on the Zagatis River, remember just outside of Philippi, ancient Philippi, on the Zagatis River, the Greek Orthodox Church has built something called St. Lydia's Baptistry. And during the year, they baptize infants there for original sin. You can see the little baptistry there on the bottom left. But once a year, the Greek Orthodox Metropolitan, who's like an archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Church from Macedonia, he comes and he does adult baptisms in the river. So there's a little historical tie-in there. So I think I finished early. So thank you very much for your attention. I think you'll really enjoy the book of Philippians, and let's have a prayer before we